Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar titled How to Do More with Less. My name is Jeanette Wider, and I'm Managing Editor of Healthcare Innovation. Today's program is sponsored by CareAlign. Thank you to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, join our webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag HILiveWebinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Supa Aaron Javia, founder and CEO of CareAlign, and Kash Patel, Executive Vice President and Chief Digital Information Officer of Hackensack Meridian Health. So I'll hand this over to you two to give some introductions about yourself.
Great, thanks. So hi, everybody. My name is Supa Aaron Javia. I am a hospitalist and a clinical informatician at the University of Pennsylvania, where I've been for the last 15 years. And I'm also founder and CEO of CareAlign, which is a spin-out of Penn Medicine, really the culmination of 15 years of work. They're really trying to make it easier for clinicians to do the right thing for patients and helping design technology to help make that happen. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to Kash.
Hello, everyone. This is I'm Kash Patel. I'm the EVP and Chief Digital Information Officer at Hackensack Meridian Health. We're New Jersey's largest health center. I have many years of experience in IT and technology and data and development. I have had the pleasure of working with Suba at Penn for a while, and prior to that, I was in New York at Mount Sinai. So relatively new here at Hackensack, and I'm excited to be on this presentation today.
Okay, so doing more with less sounds amazing, but it's a super broad topic, right? So what does this mean to both of you?
Kash, why don't you start?
Sure. From just simply a technology perspective, over years, right, 10, 20, 30 years, you just think how much technology has helped us do so many things that we would just do manually, mechanically, repeat again and again, and how we now have just taken for granted, our phone, right? And it just works seamlessly with us, has all our addresses and names, all in there all the time, and phone numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And just think about that little idea of how efficient our lives have sort of become from it. In the world of healthcare, especially if you think last 2 years of COVID and how it's impacted us in a major way in the healthcare industry, how much work, energy, rethinking of work models, rethinking of how we provide care, our sort of reactive, elastic nature on addressing the pandemic. So the idea about working with less is how do we start to think about making things more efficient in a very direct sense from a healthcare perspective? How do we get the physicians and the clinicians to have more time with the patients and less time on their screens? How do we get patients at the right place at the right time? How do we get them the right care at the right time, the right level of communications? And all of this is a fundamental sort of answer is around technology, and how do we then integrate those ideas into our systems and then sort of make adoption easier? So that's the idea of sort of doing more with less, finding more efficient ways of optimizing, tweaking, nudging to get more done and take full advantage of the technology that's available these days.
Maybe I shouldn't have had to go first because I was going to say something very similar, which is as a clinician, to me, doing more with less is exactly as you said, spending more time with patients and less on process and technology. And, as it does, exactly as you were saying, in the rest of our lives where we don't have to think about tech, it's the exact opposite in healthcare where, I want as a clinician, both for myself and for my colleagues, to spend all of my time thinking about and talking to my patients to understand what's wrong, why do I think it's happening, what do we need to do to work it up, how are we going to treat it, having that conversation with our patients so that we can develop a plan together and then make it happen. But instead, we spend so much of our time hunting and gathering for information in a dozen different systems. We spend a ton of time trying to, look through different progress notes to figure out what's happened in the past, what should we do in the future, and it's just not seamless as it should be. When we think about, I often think about pilots and how every single thing that's done is around how do we make everything as low of a cognitive load on a pilot as possible so they can focus on what matters, which is getting people to their destination safely, on time, and with a good experience, ideally. And I think we need more of a shift of that in medicine so that as clinicians, we're solely focused on our patients, what's wrong with them, how do we make them better, and with a good experience. And I agree, technology is a big part of making that happen. Really, Cash, when I think about it, we've spent a lot of time improving processes, saying how can we tweak this little thing and save 5 minutes here or save a few minutes there. But what we haven't been able to spend a lot of time on is the technology to support those processes. So you can have people with the best intentions, you can have the best processes that you've made sure are very lean, but if your tech doesn't actually help you make that happen, it just doesn't get off the ground.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of thought that you just sort of triggered in my head. You're right. We make technology changes and we make improvements, and you know this. The sort of magic is in getting adoption, and then adoption sort of training and educating and showing, right? But then there is a sort of layer behind it that I'm beginning to sort of tinker with here at Hackensack, and lots of places are beginning to do this, is sort of automation, right? The process automation pieces. We're beginning to automate a lot of, month-end closing is a really good example of, a large organization like ours. We have multiple accounts across the board. I forget how many, but hundreds of accounts, right? And each one is a process to close out. We're just basically going out and automating the closure process for something like that. And that's like 10 people's worth of work each month. It's just disappearing, and it's just taken for, it's happening now behind the scenes, right? In our world of healthcare, we're beginning to automate from monitoring systems, for example, from looking at surveillance data, right? In the example of the COVID thing around surveillance on our EDs in real time. But the automation sort of bots, the technical term in the background, are running, and they're triggering off other things. They're triggering off text messages, for example, to clinicians or to frontline staff about some level happening. So we're beginning to use some of the automation to facilitate, doing more with less, and then helping with adoption. So that's something I'm beginning to see more of in healthcare in the last few years.
There's a lot of talk about AI and ML and how we can help, automate, as you said, a lot of things. There's definitely a gray area that I'm sure we'd have fun talking about here, is how we can bring that into decision-making and clinicians' workflow. And, I think part of what we have to do before we can even get there is making it as simple as possible for us to streamline our work. So we're just spending time thinking about patients. You can't totally replace the cognitive perspective of a clinician with a machine. You can certainly augment it. You can certainly make it better. But I find a lot of people getting really excited about saying, how can we use AI to fix all of these problems with inefficiencies and errors in decision-making or communication failures? But a lot of that feels like Band-Aids and patchworks, and it can't be done in exclusion of actually improving the workflow and the technology that clinicians are using to do the work in the first place. Curious what you think about that, because I know there's a lot of excitement about what AI can do.
So if I sort of talk about AI, I'm just going to let the audience know you're talking to a physician and an engineer. And so when the physician says you can't replace the cognitive, human intelligence, the engineer in me says, watch me. That's exactly what we're going to do. So I genuinely believe that each year goes by, we get more and more knowledge around how AI works, how it's sort of thinking. Again, is something we're doing. Again, I just speak specifically about what we're doing at Hackensack. Is we created this idea of a department of predictive health, and we're creating this technology pipeline. And the idea is the technology pipeline allows us to work with outside vendors, right? Outside people that have new ideas. They come and knock on our door and say, look, we got this really cool algorithm that's going to predict ABC. We allow them to sort of work in our sandbox. They come in, work in our sandbox, we make some rules up, and they go and validate that model in our sandbox. And then our physicians will then sort of use that, and our AI team will begin to adopt that into our clinical environment, and then we'll sort of watch your performance, we'll watch your accuracy, we'll watch your adoption, we watch your sort of automation. And then as 6 months go by, and we say, all right, now this is ready to be sort of released in the wild, right? I do believe on the AI front, I think in the world of healthcare, I think there's a lot of progress in screening, in algorithms around screening and identifying potential cohorts that have a higher propensity of X. There's a lot of data available in that space. Where you are absolutely correct, the cognitive pieces are, now what, right? Am I impacting? Am I changing the medication regime? Am I changing the flow of that patient, right? Am I diagnosing electronically? Not quite so there yet. But as more and more data is available, and everybody knows data is growing at a rapid rate, and especially in healthcare, the more and more noise we have in the system. And so I think there's lots of organizations, we're working actively with Google and Amazon and Microsoft and everybody basically around trying to figure out how to normalize, how to understand that large amount of data and sort of create some value out of it. So I think the AI is beginning to have real impact. There's been some amazing use cases globally around how AI in healthcare has impacted decision making. I just saw a presentation in electronic surgery, and everybody knows a robot surgery vendor, but they're doing some really clever stuff around how the actual angle and the action of the surgeon's hand as it's moving with the robot, for example, and they're using AI to train the surgeon about if you use this angle and this depth and this method, then the outcome quality is going to improve, right? And then so AI is predicting the outcome quality in real time and advising the surgeon in real time on how best to perform that surgery. So there's an example of cognitive behavior that comes with learned human knowledge, but now the AI algorithms are sort of learning this stuff and sort of saying, I know you went left, but if you went right, your outcome is going to be better. So interesting. It's an interesting space that's a lot of interest for sure.
Yeah. So you said a couple of things I'd love to double click on or dive deeper into. So you're right. I think there is so much that we're going to learn and a lot of growth we're going to see in this field. I guess what I react to is thinking that it can fix everything now, which it simply can't, right? We have to get there and we have to learn. I think the lab that you're setting up that enables you to actually try things out is so important and something that a lot of places don't do. There's this resistance to working with outside organizations or outside tech to be able to figure out what we can design and develop, which really takes doing it in a real environment, right? You can only do so much working in a lab, separate from real clinicians, separate from real workflow. So I think that's such an essential component of being able to make leaps and bounds in this area, is having a space to actually try things out and see what works and what doesn't work. What's funny though, is when we think about pretty much every clinician is still working on paper. Even with these multi-million and billion-dollar implementations of EHRs, which we needed to go digital in our electronic health record systems, but I feel like the last mile of workflow that hasn't really transformed digitally is, as a clinician, and not just me as a doctor, but nurse, therapist, pharmacist, all of us on the front line of interacting with patients, are still working on paper. We print lists. That's the gold standard of what we're given from EHRs to work on. And that's just not okay. I mean, what other industry manages their work in such an analog way, which is simply not collaborative? So I guess I would just say, I think we need parallel streams of effort, lots of parallel streams of effort. One of them really needs to be on what I think is seen as really hard, and that's clinician workflow, and realizing that if we design things well, we can actually make changes. People will actually use it. You mentioned adoption before being such a challenge, and it's one of the things we get asked all the time. And the reality is, if you design something to make someone's life better, they're going to start using it once you show them how it improves their lives. So if we focus on workflow and the delivery of care, I think we can really make those changes.
Yeah, and, fair enough, right? And so again, two thoughts in there. You talk about organizations, and how do you sort of get organizations to be courageous? How to think in this space. Like you, I've worked in several organizations, both small and large. I've done startups too, and it's very hard. It's very hard to walk into a place and say, we're going to cure world hunger, and this is sort of how we're going to do this, right? I think all organizations, just like by their very nature, are quite different. But I am really encouraged. I'd say last 5 years, right? So 10 years prior, maybe a little longer, we all went to the sort of electronic health record, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we sort of had this idea of unified healthcare, national healthcare, one health plan, one carrier, politically, right, and sort of structurally. And now we're sort of moving to this world of, we need to open our data. We need to share our data. We need to unlock the data. We need to do more with less with our data. And we can do that if we share the data, if we make it transparent, we make it easier. Organizations are popping up all over the country from give us your data and we're going to monetize it for you. We're going to create new clinical trials for you. We're going to create new AI algorithms for you. There's organizations focusing just on the sort of AI algorithms. I think so. A lot of the innovation is happening outside of those health systems, right? And so like you just said, you can't do this in a lab, but a lot of these organizations are able to grab large volumes of data. CMS has made a lot of data available to trusted organizations, and they're now taking this kind of data and working on new algorithms. There's a huge investment increase from a VC perspective in the world of healthcare. Last 3 years alone, the amount of money being pumped into new startups in healthcare is just significantly grown. And I do think the larger organizations, and I'll just say stoic for want of a better word, are not leveraging this mindset. They're not taking advantage of this thinking or this energy, and they're sort of doing this, my baby is better than your baby kind of mindset, or we're good, you guys figure it out kind of thing. But I think these small organizations will start to overtake and run ahead of some of the core, larger, well-known sort of areas. An example in cancer, there's real-world evidence is another example. There's a lot of research being done in this space and to be able to predict the propensity for a certain kind of cancer based upon sort of real-world evidence data. All this data now comes from cancer centers, but they are not developing those algorithms internally, but it's some small startup that's sort of taking that data and thinking about it differently. And I agree with your sort of last point around our electronic health record. I wish we could go back 20 years ago and, tear up what we have today from an electronic health record perspective. It was designed to replace paper. And to your point, absolutely agree. It was designed, people are using paper because the electronic system we had was designed to replace paper. It wasn't designed with the way we're talking about now. It wasn't designed to provide, healthcare at scale, healthcare for the patients. How do they engage? How do they consume? How do they think about this as a service? It was never done that way. It was just designed to replace paper and billing, basically, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the unfortunate reality we're in. But I am encouraged. There's a lot of innovation happening in the payer space, in the new startup space. I think there's going to be a few amazing, like the equivalent of the Amazon or the Teslas are going to appear. And I think we'll start to have a very different conversation 5 years from now about how physicians think about their electronic health record.
Yeah, I completely agree. You were saying it's kind of unfortunate where we are, but very exciting where we can go. And when I think about interoperability, which is one of the questions we have from the audience, is how can interoperability help address this issue? I think it absolutely can. I mean, when you think about 20 years ago when we started, a lot of places were employing best of breed EHRs. But because of a lack of interoperability from a sheer technical perspective of what we could do with these systems, everything was siloed. So then we moved to, okay, everything has to be in one. And that's really the culture of a lot of institutions right now. But I think it's simply, it's just not possible that one system can do everything you need. In fact, if you look at other industries, every company has a tech stack, right? It's, we're going to make sure that we have the tech that we need to absolutely optimize the work and the output of marketing, of sales, of billing, of HR, and then we're going to make sure our connections between them through interoperability make sure that they all work together. I think the average company or enterprise outside of healthcare has like 300 connections through their tech stack. And clearly that's not the case in medicine. It's not nothing, but there's definitely a push to keep it as low as possible. But I'd love to see more of this type of thinking as you're talking about at Hackensack, where you have really an ecosystem or a health tech stack in a health system and leverage what is designed to be really workflow focused for each individual department, but then bring all that information together. We're lucky now with Fire and many other systems to be able to share that information better. But I'm curious if you have advice for clinicians and other people who find something that they think would really help them and want to bring it to their institution. I often hear from administrators that, people are asking for too many things all the time. There's only so much we can do because everyone's plate is a certain size. But how do we help, really figure out how to make the case for something that's really going to help someone's workflow when when it relies on integration and IT's already so busy?
So yeah, we got a question, right? And I want to sort of a perfect segue to this question about, do you think interoperability will allow you more efficient processes and overall allow us to do more with less, right? And so perfect segue around a tech stack, systems, interconnectivity and operations. In the world of healthcare, I think interoperability was sort of, the poor stepchild conversation. It was sort of done because we sort of had to do it. And and people were sharing bare minimum data. The standards were very poor. Our HR7, which is a sort of common standard in healthcare, okay. But again, the last few years, the government, from a federal perspective, has really pushed regulation around sharing of data, as sort of almost forcing the healthcare vendors out there to make their data more transparent and interchangeable between one sort of EMR and another. The payers are now beginning to share more and more data. There's organizations out there that are, I call them sort of conduits of collecting data that's going from the payer to the provider to other places, and you can sort of tap into it. I do think interoperability is the key. Candidly, we're working with Google. Google has a product which isn't, secret. It's publicly available. It's called the Health Data Engine, and it's around a standardized-ish model around data and ingesting data using Fire. And we're going to be leveraging that in the near future about putting all of our data in a sort of Fire environment, and so it can consume data, but it can also send data out in a standard-ish format for across all our health systems. So we're going to start we're thinking about a federated model here at Hackensack. Some people are doing centralized. We're thinking about a federated model around sharing our data with our alliance partners and our other relations that we have. But I think the standards are maturing. I've been on the Fire committee standards and some of the early HL7 ones. The problem with standards is you have to agree on the lowest common denominator. I mean, that's just the reality. For 10 people go in a room, all 10 kind of have to agree, and therefore you end up agreeing on what's acceptable to everybody. But again, version 1, version 2, version 3, it's definitely improving, and I think there's more and more adoption with Fire. I think what's going to be the trick here is a lot of this is starting to work on the cloud seamlessly. And we never had that in healthcare. 5 years ago, most healthcare organizations, I don't want to put my data on the cloud. I'm not so sure I can trust it. Facebook is going to know everything about me and blah, 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 right? But that's changed. There's more comfort and awareness and more healthcare entities sharing data on the cloud. And so with the interoperability, with the compute capability in the cloud, and we're a cloud-first organization, as many health systems are, I think that's going to be the direction to do sort of more with less. We'll have more and more data, all talking the same language, being able to access those same models, being able to access the same way we think about the data and how we interpret the data. And therefore, the adoption barriers become a little easier and the workflow becomes easier. And then we'll replace the physicians and all the engineers will rule the world. So.
So we have another really good question that came in from the audience, if I can interrupt. So with systems like Cerner and Epic dominating the market, how do you disrupt their stronghold on the EHR processes and allow us to get to a valuable EHR that clinicians and staff doing what we need them to do, not just interacting with technology?
I'll let the doctor take a first stab at that, but you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I have to keep clearing my throat. Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to hear what the CIO thinks about it, but I think there's a lot of different approaches here. So I have a lot of health systems developing innovation labs and innovation groups to kind of think of new ways to make things better. You have a ton of health tech companies. If you look at the HIMSS exhibit floor, there's thousands of different companies working to really address that. I think it actually goes back, though, to our last statement, which was about interoperability, because I think of Cerner and Epic and our EHRs as being this very necessary foundation to how our health systems work, right? We've digitized the paper chart, and we now have that information available. Interoperability becomes the key to now unlock this information, make it accessible and usable. I think the next piece is having really the culture and the openness to being able to work with other technologies with these foundational EHRs to now unlock the potential of all of that data that's been digitized. From so many different perspectives, as you said, Cash, there's a ton of data in the chart, right? How do we even make that useful? I'll give a side anecdote here, which is any clinician and many engineers can say there's a lot of data. Well, we wanted to actually quantify that because it feels very overwhelming as a clinician, particularly when you're making life and death decisions off of this data that's hard to mine. So we actually created a virtual lab at Penn with every note written in the chart. So this is over 6 years. It has every single note, every type of note written for every patient. It's all de-identified, but it's a virtual lab, so we can look at what language patterns are in the chart. And not even looking at vitals, labs, meds, imaging, all the objective data, just at the narrative text that people write. In 6 years, we have over 100 million notes, 33 billion words, and 194 billion characters. So to give you reference to what those crazy numbers mean, all of English Wikipedia in the world as of February has around 25 billion characters. So that means that in 1 year, one health system has created more text than in all of Wikipedia in all time. And then if you look at the average chart, has about 4,300 words. And then again, to provide context there, Hamlet, which is Shakespeare's longest written work, is about 29,000 words. So that means the average chart is about 1/6 of Hamlet. And so if I, as a clinician, am responsible for or seeing even 12, 15 patients in a day, that means I have to read Hamlet and know it 2 to 3 times in a day, which is just completely impossible, right? There's no dedicated time to find all this data. So, using other tools that work with our foundational EHRs to unlock all of this power, as you said, Cash, AI and other things to actually mine all that information to make it usable for us, and then enable clinicians to focus on their workflow. I think that's how we do that. But I think the unspoken questions there are, really paving the road to make it okay to work with other systems. Because I think many health systems and many technology groups are really, can only be in the EHR. And when the EHR can't do everything, it really hamstrings you.
What my sort of thought on this, I'll answer sort of in 2 parts too. I suspect the person asking the question, and if I read between the lines is how do you sort of break that stranglehold and create something innovative, create value, create a new company, create a new idea that sort of can go after that business that seems sort of locked down, right? And sort of that's how sort of I'm reading some of this. I think the merger of Cerner and Oracle, and obviously Epic being a large system, I think the idea, if I was the person that sort of, new startup thinking about an idea, I would go after sort of one or two single problems, right? Don't sort of attempt to say, we're gonna get rid of this stranglehold on the EHR and be able to do that, because it's not really reality, right? But go after a real problem. Go after patient satisfaction. Go after billing examples. Go after creating new insights into data. The stuff that Suba's talked about at Penn, I've had access to that data set, and there's a ton of insights available in that sort of de-identified data. So I would say go after sort of single problems, and you're unrealistic to say you can break the sort of stranglehold. The reasons that we have, fundamentally these large EMRs in the nation is, a long time ago, a lot of it was all mixed, and then, TARP money came along, and that was the incentive, right? And the incentive basically said, if you digitize all your data, the government's going to help you fund some of that, and that sort of started the journey of creating electronic systems, and then, sort of Epic dominantly and Cerner were the two sort of systems that won that race, and that's sort of where we are today. So short of some regulatory environment changing, it's going to be a hard thing to break. However, my second part of the answer is, I think the stranglehold breaks when consumers demand a different approach, right? We all talk about the Amazon. We've all used Amazon. We buy stuff on Amazon all the time. We just take it for granted, right? Kids are screaming, the spouse is screaming, or one needs something at home. We just 4 minutes is done. It's here the next day. We don't even think twice about it, right? I think that consumer demand is going to drive how we sort of change healthcare. I think that consumer demand about I want to make an appointment, but I'm going to change it to a telemedicine, and I want my medicine delivered to me in Florida because I'm going there for vacation. All of these things it's so hard to do today in a large health system. I know it sounds easy. Amazon does it all the time, but it's very hard to do something like that in a health system. But I think that consumer demand will drive a lot more change and innovation. But the engineer in me is already thinking about sort of new ideas. And one of the ideas that we're experimenting with is think about the idea of sort of crypto and Bitcoin and encrypting your healthcare record. So it's a very high level sort of use case and it won't kill the industry today, but it could happen. Think about your healthcare records. Legally, it can be extracted, right, from your healthcare vendor. So we can extract all the healthcare records from Cerner, from personal ones, right, from Epic, from Cerner, put it into a key, a digital key. I can walk to a physician, right, in another city, in another town, give them that key, unlock my record for that physician to see. They can provide care, and then they say, okay, we're done with care, and all of that data then it goes back to my key. And so I walk around as a patient with my data on my key, and then I choose to give access to physicians or clinicians at the time. That is truly saying, right, the data belongs to the patient. Right now, there's an ethical argument around who owns the data. So we won't go down there. But think about this sort of new way, a new idea of how consumers will demand healthcare, and I think that will be the big disruptor.
I think that's really interesting, and I agree that consumer demand drives a lot of change. I'd love to also see some more attention to the quadruple aim, and I don't want to think of a clinician as a consumer, but they are the delivery arm of care. And that's I think one of the big mismatches in medicine and in healthcare, which is that your user of the system is not the purchaser of the system, so they're not able to apply those same pressures that you would normally have with your average tech, right? So you as a user of Amazon really help drive what Amazon does, but it's not the same way with clinicians and healthcare. But I will say that I think step one is recognition that things need to be better. So we're there. And some of the benefit of a lot of these innovation labs, as you're doing at Hackensack, as we have at Penn and many other groups, is giving clinicians and patients the space to actually develop new things. Thinking about even the work that we've done at CareAlign, it really started with, here is a problem and we need to fix it. And having the space to say, let's try something and not be afraid to not get it right the first time. Know that we have to be able to iterate on it and improve things. and try many different things before we figure out the right way to do it. So having that space to actually do that, as you do in most other industries, I think is really important. But all of that was done in the umbrella of a health system with an EHR, with Epic, right? And so it's not, as you said, breaking a stranglehold or doing something in spite of them. It's really doing it along with the EHR and saying, building on top of this foundation that we have in place and then taking it to the next level. It's actually one of the benefits of being able to develop something from within a health system as opposed to outside of it, because outside you're really just focused on, what is the one thing I'm going to fix and try to go sell that. Whereas on the inside a health system, you can really focus on, we just want to improve care. But as a follow-up to that, thinking about how do you advocate for things that you want in a health system, you have to be able to tie that back to the business of what a health system needs, and that's one of the things we've learned is, okay, we built something that works well for people. Now, how do we prove that it's actually valuable for the business of healthcare? And so that health systems have enough drive to say, yeah, we really need to address this right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What sort of triggers that is, let's sort of pivot a little on and I'll talk about some of the examples of what we're doing in Hackensack around some of this. So, one of the things that we've done fundamentally at Hackensack is we actually shifted strategically to Google. And what that means is we're 95, I think 97% all Chromebooks everywhere, right? And including our hospital environment. I'm speaking to you on a Chromebook today. And when I first joined, I was thinking, no, I don't, I want my Windows, Microsoft Outlook, and et cetera, et cetera. But the regardless of which side of the fence of technology you like, going back to that technology stack piece, right? It's been a phenomenal journey for the organization. We're all on one platform. We can all talk to each other. The file sharing and the data sharing has been amazing, absolutely amazing in a Google environment. And we've taken so many things for granted. It's a different way of working, right, for sure. But here's a real example of doing, more with less. The productivity increase in our communications and our working and our sharing of data. We're so, we are consistently, we all now go in a room online and we're just sharing a document together and we're just editing in real time, right? And now with remote working and hybrid models, the platform has just been really, really impressive in terms of how it sort of helped us in the model. On the sort of, on the healthcare side, we're beginning to create a strategic sort of focus on optimization, right? This RPA thing I spoke about, sort of automation. We created this department for predictive health that's building algorithms. We're taking those algorithms, we're moving to our sort of optimization team. The optimization team is going by service line, by specialty area, by practice area, one at a time, and saying, so one of the algorithms we're building is an ability to sort of predict CKD stage 3, so chronic kidney disease, right? And the math is whatever it is, but figuring out how that gets adopted and how that gets used, there's sort of two ways. One is we can send a letter out to all our patients saying, look, we think you should go and speak to your doctor about something. Another way is to put it in line in our clinical EHR. And so when the patient presents for any other reason, this sort of pops up in there and saying, this person needs to be screened, or a bit of both, right? And we're experimenting with sort of which is effective and what we can do and sort of how we can't do it. I mentioned the idea of creating a innovation pipeline. So we have this sandbox environment where new ideas, both internal and external, can come to our environment and start to say, here's a new idea, here's how do you. So we're doing something with the OR, and we're sort of figuring something out there. But it's a very novel idea on an approach that we're going to sort of experiment with. And so this idea of failing fast, I'm positively encouraging the team to I use the word, I use the same word in two different ways. I say fail fast to my team, but when I speak to the leaders and the other executives, I use the word failing forward, because the word failing fast is sort of a negative conversation. So I say, we're going to fail forward, right? And so the idea is that we're making progress, and we're learning, we're making progress, and we're sort of doing this quickly. But that's a culture change conversation, right? That's not a tactical piece of something. And then the last part from a healthcare perspective is, I wish we had more Subas in our environment too. I've worked with her.
Right back at you.
The energy that you bring, or the excitement and the energy, that's the kind of people we need on the clinical side, right? To sort of partner with and to try these things, because we don't have that partnership and that relationship. And so there's an example of how organizations can work. You have to find the right chemistry and the right people to fail fast, to try things out, right? Not to sort of blame each other or it didn't work. What didn't work? Why didn't it work? Let's sort of do something else and learn from that experience to sort of move things forward. So there was a bunch of things that, so we've created the governance thing, we've created this pipeline thing, we've got the executive excited by some of this stuff, we've got some board members involved. So it does require a very deliberate mindset across the board. So it's not just a technology thing, right? But it's a very deliberate strategy on how you create influence around adoption and new ideas.
I really love so much of what you said, and thank you. We need more people like you really setting up these structures, because there isn't enough openness to trying these different things. But it's interesting. I used to teach incoming interns and doctors and residents how to use the EHR, how to integrate technology into their work. And they get very excited about, oh, wow, you've built this great thing called CareAlign. Tell me about it. And I'm going to touch on two things here. The first is that they were all very excited to engage and very excited to say, oh, I want to see what I can build and how can I improve workflow? And they have that excitement. And the way to cultivate it that I found is by actually listening to them and letting them have a say in things, letting them participate in designing the tools that they use so they can see the outcomes of what they're doing. And then you get that positive feedback loop to say, oh, great, I had a great idea. It worked or it didn't work. We failed forward. And now I'm excited to do another one. And unfortunately, that's not available enough in typical systems. I think I've seen too many people kind of come in with that wide-eyed excitement and then get crushed, essentially, because they're like, oh, you mean it's a 18-month development cycle to get anything done in our system? I'm going to graduate by then. How do I really get excited and participate in this? But that's really been one, the other thing I wanted to mention in what you talked about is teamwork. And when I think of, Google Drive and Google Docs or OneBox, all of these different tools that help us work together, there's no better example of how do you make things more efficient? Well, you share the workload. You work as a team. If 10 of us are taking care of a patient and each of us is working in our own silo, in our own little cubby of what needs to get done, and then trying to figure out what everyone else did, that is extremely inefficient. So, that's the core of what we ended up doing with CareAlign, is saying, how do we make sure that everything's about the patient's at the center, and then everyone involved in the care of the patient is working together to say what's wrong with them, what needs to get done, who's doing it, who's already completed what, and then how do we make sure things don't fall through the cracks when we close all of those loops. And as you said, the EHRs were really designed to replace paper charts. They weren't really designed for this workflow piece that needs to happen. And frankly, the way we practice has changed, right? A couple decades ago, things were very individually focused. You did have physicians working on their own, whereas now care is much more team-based. But it's been one of the most exciting things to see that if you actually design something that helps give you data when you need it, where you need it, how you need it, then clinicians will use it and actually change their workflow. And similarly, if you help enable team-based care, then people will actually find that saves them time and they're able to do more with less. So I think that's it's been a lot of great proof that both designing things well and helping people work as a team can help us be more efficient.
Okay, so thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. And we've had a bunch more questions come in from the audience, but I would like to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time still if you have a question for our presenters. So the first question is, how do institutions make decisions on using new technology?
So,
that is all you, Cash.
Yeah, you know, so the three different models, right? There's three different models around technology. During the era of my career, I would walk in the room and say, "Look, we need to buy this tool, we need to buy this software," and nobody would sort of listen to me, right? And one of the things as I sort of matured in my sort of career journey, what you have to do is you have to find. If you're asking this question as an inside person, is how do I get my organization to adopt a new technology? What you have to do is go and solve a business problem, right? What value are you creating? Most business people, the CFO and the leaders and the CEOs, they don't really care about the technology per se. They care about what business problem you're solving. And if you ask these questions as an outsider to sort of go and sell into an organization, honestly, what you have to do is you have to find people that understand what you're offering. So both understand the inside business problem, but they also have to understand the technology opportunities, right? That you're, and so you have to find a way, somebody who's willing to connect the dots. You can't be about technology saying this is the latest version of Excel or this is the latest version of this tool. You have to go and connect it with a business problem. And most institutions have, large organizations, especially these days, have a very formal process. They do an RFP and there's a procurement process that, three bids, et cetera, to go in. And so if you're an outsider trying to do business with an organization, go make friends with their procurement department. Learn the process. Learn what it takes to become a named vendor. Go and get on their list of people that they would send out an RFP to so that you can at least participate in the process. So, that was the three-part answer to that question.
Very well said.
Really good advice. Yeah, I had never thought about becoming friends with the procurement department, but I do think that having to define the business case is a really important part of what we're doing, and I think it can be challenging when the clinical work that you're doing may not always tie directly to a line item on a budget, and that's where hopefully data can help in terms of mining what the downstream effects are of what we're doing. But without those direct lines, sometimes that's a challenge. So sometimes you need vision and people who are saying, yeah, I see the potential in that.
Okay, our next question, and this is a really good one. I like the idea of using Google as they have amazing data sharing tools, but we have found that it is hard to get the vendors to move even with real-time data. How do you use data to move your foundational EHR vendors?
Yeah, I disagree with that. We have a very large, Epic environment. We're a massive Epic shop. We're, $7 billion ish hospital, and everything is on Epic, and we have a Google, and we moved all our Epic environment to our Google Cloud. And so while Epic does not run on Google Cloud today, it will in the future at some point because it's running on other clouds, right? We're moving our data now real time. Yeah, there's the interpretation that comes into this, right? I've worked in healthcare data for 20 plus years, and real time is interesting. And while real time does not exist in the cloud, those streams of real time data can be interfaced to our compute environment in the cloud. And so I'm not so sure it's difficult, but I'm not so sure how much real time data. If you're looking at telemetry data, for example, by the time you capture the signal and you move it to the cloud, it could probably be too late to act on the algorithm that you're trying to build, right? And so that's going to be based upon the use case that you're sort of going after and you're trying to sort of figure out. But the technology is there. We're moving data in as quickly as it's created for our world.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that question is also around how do you get vendors to change what they have or to implement things that you're looking for. And it might be that, we need to have the ability to have other tools that work with the EHR and using things like Google to find the data, find the opportunities to standardize, find the opportunities to reduce variation and be more efficient. I think that just like pop health tools, right, are helping us at a population level to say where are the areas that we need to focus on at a large level for clinical care. And the outcomes that we need to improve for a population. I think the second piece to that is how do you operationalize that and actually provide tactical opportunities to implement these changes at the workflow level for clinicians. So maybe it's kind of a twofold thing. You get the data, you find the insights, and then you actually have a way to implement change. And if you can do it in your EHR, excellent. And if you can't, then using other tools to work with them until you can eventually get it into your EHR if that's where it goes.
Okay, next question. Do you have an innovation officer role? And if so, how do they integrate into the typical IT department structure?
In our organization at Hackensack, we don't have an innovation role. Let me rephrase that. We do have an innovation role, but not in the way we're talking about today. It's more to do with the discovery of sort of molecules and bioscience, and that's how traditional healthcare systems have sort of worked. I had that role when I was at New Yorkers at Mount Sinai. I had that sort of function as part of my world, not necessarily the title, but I created an innovation team at Sinai doing sort of software development, sort of new ideas. In New York, we were part of the IT team, and I've worked with innovation leaders in other organizations outside of the IT team. This is one of those questions that when I speak with our HR people, it's honestly, it's about chemistry. I worked with the innovation, I say department at Penn, because Penn had quite a complex and very sophisticated focus on innovation to having buildings and people and departments in that area and working around innovation. So I think it's a lot to do with sort of chemistry, shared vision, shared ideas, and shared sort of approaches to sort of problems. And how they integrate, the working with Suba is a really good example of innovation and sort of the relationship. And I think the way they integrate is based upon finding a sort of common value. Large IT organizations sometimes are very stoic, right? And they sort of they have this sort of approach where we're building a system, it's uptime, we patched it, we have a server, and we're done. That's what we do, right? And the sort of more nimble, innovative ones are saying, right, how can we improve? How can we create programs? How can we create AI algorithms? How can we create the data? And then that sort of starts to drift into the sort of innovation sort of notion of, how can we create value for the organization? How can we monetize this? Is there something that we can do here? So I'm not so sure there's a standard answer, except sort of saying it's going to be based upon the chemistry and the sort of structure the organization has around innovation.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think something I would add is thinking about, which is part of what you said, the reporting structure and the implementation arm of the innovation group. So, in my work with CareAlign at Penn, it was really unique in that it was a true collaboration between the innovation department, the IT department, and the office of the CMIO. And, in some places they all report into IT, some places they're all separate. At Penn, they're all kind of, at the same, reporting level. But it really takes a very close integration of effort, as you said, alignment of priorities, but then also implementation. A lot of times, I think what innovation groups struggle with is they come up with a good idea, they try it in a small pilot, and then it's really hard to scale it across the institution or the health system. And, so defining that path of, okay, if we do a pilot with our innovation group and it works, how do we then transition that work to then be managed by the IT department? And, is that even what we're going to do? Because a lot of IT departments might say, I don't want to have to now manage all of these new programs, which, is also completely understandable. So, making sure that we think about from idea, or actually from problem definition to idea to pilot to full-scale implementation, what are those resources and what is that process? It necessitates a tight coupling of your engineering team, so IT, and the innovation group so that you can make that happen. The way we did that was actually we worked with innovation, we worked with the CMIO group, but our engineers were in IT. So, we kind of started in the place where we then scaled from.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more. So how do you address the click counting burden physicians express?
Yeah. So for those people that don't understand that question. This is where, the engineer in me and the doctor will argue a lot. And the physicians would say, how much stuff are you going to throw at us? It takes us 22 clicks to create that order, or whatever, count of clicks to create this piece of data that you want, right? And on one hand, I totally agree, right? The number of, the sort of, in principle, we're trying to design a system where it says, hands off of the keyboard and eyes on the patient. That's sort of the philosophy of what we're trying to do. But then we get into the CFO, the CMO, the CEO, the CXO. They need this, they need this, they need this piece of data. They need to create some knowledge about something, some workflow, some information. So it's always a constant sort of push and pull about how much stuff we need a physician to do or the clinician to do, and how we capture that data, right? And then the sort of burden of the clinician sort of spending more and more time on their computers. And I'm on this particular topic, I side with the physicians every time. I say the burden's on the technology people to make it simpler and easier. We have to find ways to automate this. We have to find ways that they can spend more time with the patients. I think the average time a physician spends with the patient is about 4 minutes, of which 3 minutes is in staring at the screen, right? And so there's very little time where there's actually eyeballs to eyeballs conversation going on in a clinical setting. And so we count in my team when we do analysis and when we make changes, we're actually click counting ourselves in our test environment. We're sort of seeing what it took, what changed, and what is that burden that's going to happen? What are we changing? And if we're adding clicks in one place, we're trying to remove it in another place, right? And that's a constant conversation that overall physicians are expressing concern with more and more electronic stuff that they have to deal with. It's less time with the patients. And I know Subra will have an opinion on that as a doctor. So
just a little. Yeah, I think this actually really wraps up so many of the things that we've been talking about. As you said, number one, if you design something well, then you shouldn't have to do so many clicks, right? And I think that our systems that we're using, many of them were designed 20 years ago. Everything in the digital world has changed drastically when it comes to user interface in the last even 5 years, let alone 20 years, but not EHRs. So we need to really take a close eye on usability, workflow, user experience from the clinician perspective, and redesign how we do things. And part of that means throwing out assumptions of how we need to get things done. On principle, though, I think a huge part of it is, instead of saying, we need this information and we want the clinicians or someone to go do another step to give us this information, technology gives us the ability now to say, I want to take this information out of the work you're already doing, right? So with big data, with ML, with AI, with just technology designed well, we can do that. One, and I think really a clear and really important example is the problem list, right? So the problem list came into the EHR before many EHRs even had provider documentation. And you will find that most clinicians absolutely hate the problem list in the EHR, which really sounds crazy, because as a clinician, everything I do is about the problems. What am I addressing? Why do I think it's there? What do I need to do about it? All of our decision support and algorithms are based off of the problems that we're addressing. And yet the problem list has not helped us with those things. But now we have the ability to say, you know what, I shouldn't have to go separately write on another screen that this patient has, a certain type of diabetes. You should be able to see that I've already written about that in my note and pull it and keep that as part of the record. So I think if we can really, reintegrate workflow with the information we want to pull, and then the data we want to pull and the information we want to get out of that data, so that we're not asking people to do more work. We're just asking them to work smarter so we can leverage that data, and using engineering to make that happen. That's really a huge way to reduce clicks, is saying the burden should be on the technology to make it happen rather than on the clinician to do extra work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So talk about that one for an hour.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank both of you for today's excellent webinar. I would also like to thank our sponsor, CareAlign, for making today's program possible. Finally, I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us in the future for another healthcare innovation webinar. This concludes today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Cash and Jeanette, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. This is great.